Why Nokia lost the smartphone war. In 2007, Nokia was at the top of the mobile phone industry. Its phones were everywhere. Millions of people trusted the brand. Nokia had the technology, the manufacturing scale, the distribution network, and one of the strongest names in consumer electronics. Then Apple released the iPhone, and Nokia didn't collapse overnight. That's what makes the story so interesting. The company had years to respond. But while Nokia was trying to protect the business that had made it successful, Apple and Google were building something completely different. Within just a few years, the company that had dominated mobile phones was fighting for survival. This is the story of how Nokia lost the smartphone war. The rise of Nokia. Before Nokia became a smartphone giant, it wasn't even primarily a phone company. The Finnish corporation had businesses ranging from rubber and cables to electronics. But during the 1990s, Nokia made a decisive move toward telecommunications. And it turned mobile phones into a global consumer product. Nokia's strength wasn't just one great phone. It was an entire machine. The company could design phones, manufacture them at enormous scale, distribute them around the world, and sell devices at almost every price point. Its phones became famous for reliability. And then there was Symbian. For years, Symbian was one of the most important smartphone operating systems in the world. Nokia built an enormous ecosystem around it. By the middle of the 2000s, the company had become the dominant force in mobile phones. Nokia wasn't trying to become the next big smartphone company. It already was the big phone company, and that distinction would become critical. The world changes. Then, in January 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco. Apple introduced the iPhone. At first, Nokia had reasons to be skeptical. The iPhone was expensive. It had no physical keyboard. It was entering a market Nokia already dominated, and Nokia had years of experience making phones. But Apple wasn't really competing on the same terms. The iPhone wasn't simply another phone. It was a computer, a touchscreen interface, an operating system, and eventually an enormous software ecosystem built around applications. That changed the definition of what a smartphone could be. And then came Google. Android gave hardware manufacturers another powerful smartphone platform. Instead of competing only against individual phones, Nokia was now competing against ecosystems. In 2011, Stephen Elop would describe the situation bluntly. The battle was no longer simply about devices. It had become a war of ecosystems. By then, Nokia was already losing ground. The problem inside Nokia. The problem wasn't that Nokia suddenly stopped being innovative. The problem was that its innovation wasn't reaching consumers quickly enough. Nokia had multiple smartphone platforms and projects competing for attention. Symbian was increasingly difficult to develop for. MeeGo was supposed to become a high-end alternative, but development was slow. Meanwhile, Apple had created a tightly controlled hardware and software experience. Google was building Android across multiple manufacturers. And developers were following the platforms where consumers were going. Nokia was still extremely powerful. But the market was changing underneath it. The company had optimized itself for the old mobile phone industry. The new industry rewarded something different. Software, developers, applications, services, speed, and user experience. That was the real threat. Nokia wasn't simply losing a battle over phones. It was losing a battle over what a phone was becoming. Chapter 4. The Burning Platform. In February 2011, Stephen Elop sent a message to Nokia employees that would become one of the most famous corporate documents in technology. He described Nokia as standing on a burning platform. He argued that the company had fallen behind Apple and Android and was no longer competing with the right weapons. He also acknowledged that Nokia had missed major trends and was moving too slowly. The situation was becoming impossible to ignore. So Nokia made a dramatic decision. It would abandon Symbian as its primary smartphone platform. It would also move away from MeeGo as the main path forward, and Nokia would partner with Microsoft. Windows Phone would become Nokia's primary smartphone platform. It was a bold move, but it came with a huge risk. Nokia was effectively jumping from one ecosystem into another, while Apple and Android were already gaining momentum. The Lumia bet. Nokia's answer was Lumia. The phones were attractive, the hardware was competitive, and Nokia still had enormous manufacturing expertise. But hardware wasn't enough anymore. The smartphone market was becoming an ecosystem game. Apple had iOS. Google had Android. Both had enormous developer communities and growing application ecosystems. Windows Phone was the third major option, but being third in an ecosystem war is dangerous. Developers have limited resources. Consumers want the applications everyone else is using. And manufacturers want to sell devices where demand is already strong. This created a vicious cycle. Fewer users meant fewer developers. Fewer developers meant fewer applications. Fewer applications made the platform less attractive to users. And the cycle was difficult to break. Nokia had a great brand. It had good hardware, but it no longer controlled the platform underneath the experience. The fall. The decline became severe. Nokia's smartphone business struggled as Apple and Android expanded. The company issued profit warnings. Its financial performance deteriorated, and the strategic decision to move away from its existing smartphone platforms created another problem. Customers now knew that Symbian was being replaced. The old platform had a limited future, but the new Windows Phone ecosystem was still trying to establish itself. Nokia was caught between two worlds. The old world was disappearing. The new world hadn't arrived quickly enough, and the smartphone market was moving extremely fast. By the time Nokia's new strategy was fully in place, the market had already changed dramatically. The company that once set the pace was now trying to catch up. What really killed Nokia? It's tempting to say, the iPhone killed Nokia, but that's too simple. The iPhone was a catalyst. Android was another. The deeper problem was Nokia's failure to adapt quickly enough to the new economics of the smartphone industry. Nokia was extraordinarily good at building phones. But smartphones were increasingly about building platforms. The winners controlled the operating system, the applications, the developer ecosystem, the services, and the user experience. Nokia had enormous strengths, but many of those strengths belonged to the previous era, and Nokia took too long to shift them toward the new one. The lesson. Nokia's story isn't really about making bad phones. It's about what happens when a company becomes extremely successful at one version of the future. For years, Nokia's scale was its greatest advantage. Its global reach was an advantage. Its manufacturing expertise was an advantage. Its brand was an advantage. But when the market changed, those advantages weren't enough by themselves. The smartphone revolution changed the rules, and Nokia was forced to play a new game while its competitors were already building the winning ecosystems. That's the dangerous part of disruption. You don't always lose because your product is bad. Sometimes you lose because the market changes faster than your company does. Nokia didn't fail because it couldn't build phones. It failed because the future stopped being about phones. And Nokia was too slow to realize it. That is how one of the most powerful technology companies in the world lost the smartphone war.